Hello, everyone. I'm glad you're here. Welcome in. Today, we'll be focusing on incarceration, policing, and state sanctioned violence. Our video lecture today will move in 5 parts. We'll begin with defining state sanctioned violence, then, we'll trace its foundations across the 4 core communities in ethnic studies. And from there, we'll examine the scale of mass incarceration and its expansion into the late 20th century. We'll consider how state violence extends beyond prisons into other institutions. And then we'll close with reflection and application. So, defining state sanctioned violence. This is referring to harm that is authorized or protected by the state. And we see this through policing, incarceration, detention, and surveillance, not as isolated events, but as interconnected systems. And these systems are structural, rooted in policy and institutional design, meaning that the harm is embedded into how institutions are organized. Through our very multidisciplinary lenses within ethnic studies, we examine how those structures function and how they produce patterned and unequal outcomes across communities. If these systems are rooted in policy and institutional design, we can trace those roots historically. And so, starting with African American communities, modern policing systems can be traced back to slave patrols in the 18th and 19th centuries. These patrols were created to capture Africans that were being held in enslavement, suppress rebellion, and control movement. And they also monitored gatherings, enforced curfews, searched homes without consent, and punished those who were found off plantations without specific written permission. Their role was not only enforcement, it was also constant surveillance and the maintenance of racial hierarchy. After emancipation, that control didn't just disappear, it shifted in form. Through black codes and minor charges like vagrancy laws, formerly enslaved peoples were criminalized and arrested. The convict leasing system allowed states to basically lease incarcerated Black men to private industries using criminalization as a legal mechanism to impose forced labor. Under Jim Crow, law enforcement continued to uphold segregation and racial hierarchy, regulating everyday movement and reinforcing these racial boundaries. So, when we look at present day disparities in incarceration, we're not seeing something random. We're seeing continuity in how control has been structured and enforced. If we shift our focus, we can see that state sanctioned violence in Native American communities operates differently, but has also been central to expansion and control. For Native American and American Indian communities, state sanctioned violence operates in several ways, including land dispossession and the ongoing suppression of tribal sovereignty. Federal policies of removal displaced sovereign American Indian nations from their lands, often enforced through military force. Reservation systems were created to confine Native communities to designated territories and place governance under federal control, limiting political autonomy, self determination, and restricting sovereignty. Boarding schools were institutionalized as a part of U.S. colonization and forced assimilation policies. American Indian children were removed from their families, their lands, their communities, prohibited from speaking their languages, and punished for practicing their cultures. The removal of children and suppression of language, culture, and identity meets the definition of cultural genocide, an attempt to erase Indigenous identity and sever intergenerational continuity. From an ethnic studies perspective, these systems are inseparable from settler colonialism and the ongoing regulation of Indigenous sovereignty. These examples show how state sanctioned violence has operated through colonization and suppression of sovereignty. We see different forms of state violence emerge in Chicanx and Latinx communities, particularly through the criminalization of migration and labor. And so we'll take a look at that here. For Chicanx and Latinx communities, state sanctioned violence has been closely tied to immigration enforcement and the policing of labor. Across the 20th and 21st centuries, Mexican and Latinx communities have been racialized and dehumanized under the label of illegal. This label has shaped public discourse, law enforcement priorities, and policy. Immigration raids, deportations, and detention practices have targeted working class communities, shaping who can work, where families can live, and whether or not households can remain intact. Policing has also targeted Latinx youth and labor organizers through gang injunctions, raids, and surveillance. State power has disrupted community organizing and worker mobilization. Today's immigration enforcement systems continue to expand that reach. In recent years, tens of thousands of people are held in immigration detention on any given day, with large shares lacking criminal convictions. And policies increasingly rely on civil and administrative authority rather than traditional criminal courts. So, what we see here is the regulation of migration and labor through enforcement practices that extend beyond the criminal legal system. And if we shift our focus again, we see another configuration of state power emerge in Asian American communities, centered on exclusion, incarceration, and surveillance. And so let's take a look at that. These patterns become especially clear in moments of immigration restriction and wartime enforcement. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 marked the first federal law banning immigration explicitly on race. Angel Island functioned as a detention site where Asian immigrants were interrogated and held for extended periods of time. During World War II, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated without due process despite citizenship status. And more recently, after 9/11, Muslim, South Asian, and Arab communities experienced expanded surveillance and state monitoring. These examples illustrate how citizenship status has not guaranteed protection from racialized state power. Which brings us to state violence beyond the carceral system. So I want to emphasize that state sanctioned violence does not operate only through prisons and jails. It can extend into other institutions, including education and child welfare systems. When law enforcement is embedded in schools, discipline can shift from educational to punitive. Instead of being handled by teachers or administrators, students may be ticketed, arrested, or removed from schools for behaviors that had once been treated as school based issues. And this contributes to what is often called the school to prison pipeline, a pattern in which disciplinary policies and school based policing increase the likelihood that students, and particularly Black students, enter the criminal legal system. We also see long term consequences. Early contact with law enforcement is linked to lower graduation rates, continued system involvement, and reduced employment opportunities. So, when we step back and we look at how education, policing, and labor systems intersect, we begin to see how harm can be reproduced across institutions and communities. So, as you think about this, consider what happens when multiple systems reinforce one another? How does that shape life outcomes over time? How does that shape opportunities and outcomes for various communities? I want you to be thinking about this. Now, let's connect what we've discussed to the contemporary scale of incarceration within the United States. The United States ranks among the highest globally in its use of incarceration. Today, over 5 million people are under some form of criminal legal supervision, including prison, jail, or probation or parole. Nearly 2 million of those individuals are incarcerated in prisons and jails at any given time. In the early 70s, in the early 1970s, that number was approximately $360,000. Now, if we take a look at the graph here, we can see from 1925 at the start of the graph through the early 1970s, the prison population rises and falls ever so slightly, but remains relatively stable for decades. Then, in the beginning, mid 1970s to 80s, we start to see a sharp and sustained increase. That dramatic expansion reflects structural shifts, changes in law, sentencing policy, enforcement priorities, and punishment across practices. These numbers are not simply about individual crime. They reflect decisions about how laws are written, how penalties are structured, and which communities are targeted. So, as you continue with the reading, I invite you to consider what social, political, and economic forces contributed to this expansion that we're seeing. And when you place this growth alongside earlier foundations that we've discussed and that we've been discussing, what patterns begin to emerge for you? What do you start to see here? So before we close, let's take a step back and reflect on what we've covered. Incarceration and policing are not isolated practices. They're forms of state sanctioned violence produced through law and institutional design. We've seen how these systems take distinct forms across communities through racial control, removal, and confinement, migration enforcement, exclusion, and surveillance. We've also seen that they extend beyond prisons into educational systems, immigration enforcement, and child welfare institutions. When we connect those foundations to contemporary systems, we can begin to see how deeply rooted structures continue to shape present outcomes. So, with that in mind, I'd like you to apply this framework into your journal reflection. And as you write, consider what patterns stand out to me or what patterns stand out to you. And what do those patterns suggest about institutions, about how institutions exercise power? Choose one institution that we've been discussing. This could be policing, immigration enforcement, education, child welfare, and then analyze how that institution shapes experiences of at least one of the four core communities. And in your response, incorporate one foundational example. So, one of the examples we've talked about from today's lecture to support your reasoning. And I want to sort of frame this. So, this is an invitation to practice praxis, applying what we've been covering and learning and discussing together by making connections between structural foundations and contemporary systems. So, as you write, focus on structure. Consider how law, policy, and institutional design shape outcomes across communities. With that being said, I definitely want to thank you for engaging thoughtfully with this material. As you complete your journal reflection, focus on applying the concepts from this lecture, especially the idea of state sanctioned violence as structural. And as always, if questions come up while you're writing, please reach out to me or come visit me during student hours. I'm here for you, and I'm happy to continue this conversation. So take care, and I'll see you next time.